He thought he was the smartest man in the building. But in less than 10 minutes, a woman he didn't even notice would prove him wrong and save a company from losing nearly $1 million an hour. The trading floor at Orion Systems pulsed with tension as screens flashed red across the glass-walled control center, numbers dropping, alarms chiming, voices rising over one another in sharp, clipped panic while Daniel Brooks stood at the center of it all, jaw tight, sleeves rolled, barking orders at a team of engineers who were already scrambling. "We're bleeding 50 grand a minute. Why is this not fixed yet?" His voice cut through the chaos, sharp and impatient, but no one answered with confidence because no one had a solution. Laptops glowed, fingers flew, but every attempt failed. Every patch triggered another cascade of errors, and the room, despite all its intelligence, felt suddenly small, fragile, exposed. Just beyond the circle of urgency, moving quietly along the polished floor, Evelyn Carter pushed her cleaning cart, her presence almost invisible against the urgency of million-dollar decisions. Her uniform plain, her steps measured, her eyes lowered the way people learn to look when they've been ignored long enough. She paused briefly near one of the terminals, just for a second, as a stream of code reflected faintly in her gaze. Something flickered there, recognition, but it passed so quickly no one noticed. "Step aside if you don't know what you're doing." Daniel snapped at one of the junior engineers, frustration bleeding into arrogance, and that was when someone, half joking, half cruel, muttered just loud enough, "Maybe the cleaner can fix it." A ripple of laughter followed, not loud, but sharp, cutting through the tension like a release valve. A few smirks, a few glances, the kind that dismissed without thinking. Evelyn didn't react, not at first. She simply stood there, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her cart, the hum of machines filling the silence between breaths. Then, slowly, she looked up again at the screen, this time longer, her eyes steady, focused, as if the chaos around her had faded into something distant. Daniel didn't even notice her, too consumed with his own unraveling control. "We don't have time for guesses," he said, voice tightening. "We need solutions." And still, no one had one. The clock kept ticking, the losses kept climbing, and somewhere in that pressure, in that narrowing window where ego begins to crack, something shifted, because Evelyn Carter, the woman no one had seen, gently set her mop aside, her movement quiet but deliberate, and in that small, almost unremarkable moment, the balance in the room began to change, though no one realized it yet. Not Daniel, not the engineers, not the ones who had just laughed, because sometimes, the person who understands the problem best is the one you never thought to ask. The room did not notice the moment the shift truly happened, because it was quiet, almost invisible, the kind of moment that does not announce itself. Evelyn stepped closer to the terminal, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, her fingers hovering above the keyboard for a brief second, as if listening to something deeper than the noise around her. Daniel finally glanced in her direction, irritation flashing across his face. "What are you doing?" he snapped, his tone sharp with disbelief. A few engineers turned, confused, then amused. One of them chuckled under his breath. "She is serious," another whispered, barely containing a smirk. But Evelyn did not look at any of them. Her eyes remained on the screen, steady, focused. "You have a cascading failure in your dependency chain," she said quietly, her voice calm, almost too calm for the chaos surrounding it. The words hung in the air for a second, unfamiliar coming from someone they had already dismissed. Daniel frowned, stepping closer. "That is not possible. We checked that," he replied quickly, defensive, but there was a flicker of uncertainty beneath his confidence. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, scanning lines of code that had overwhelmed the entire team. "You checked the surface," she said, still calm. "But the trigger is recursive. It is looping through an outdated patch from 3 versions ago." The nearest engineer blinked, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion. "Wait, that cannot be right," he muttered, already typing, retracing steps they thought they had exhausted. The room began to quiet, not completely, but enough for tension to sharpen. Daniel crossed his arms, watching her now, not as a cleaner, but not yet as anything else. "And you know this how?" he asked, his tone lower, more controlled. Evelyn did not answer directly. Instead, she reached forward and adjusted a line of code, her movements precise, deliberate, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. If you isolate this function, she continued, and reroute the call through a stable build, you stop the loop. Her fingers moved again, faster now, commands appearing across the screen, the system responding in real time. One warning light flickered, then disappeared. Another followed. The alarms softened. Then one by one began to fall silent. The engineer beside her leaned in, eyes widening. She is right, he whispered, almost to himself. That is the root error. Daniel's posture shifted, just slightly. The confidence that once filled the room now replaced with something quieter, something heavier. Realization beginning to settle in. Evelyn did not pause. She continued, not just fixing, but refining, stabilizing what they had barely managed to understand. The system metrics climbed back into safe ranges, losses slowing, then stopping. The room fell into a complete silence now. No laughter, no whispers, just the hum of machines returning to normal. Evelyn stepped back from the terminal as if nothing extraordinary had happened, wiping her hands lightly on a cloth from her cart. Daniel stared at the screen, then at her, words forming but never quite leaving his mouth. And in that silence, something became undeniable. The person they had overlooked was the only one who truly saw the problem from the beginning. No one moved at first, as if the room itself needed a moment to catch up with what had just happened. The screens that had been bleeding red only minutes ago now glowed with stable metrics, clean lines, controlled systems. And for the first time that day, there was no alarm, no shouting, just a quiet that felt heavier than the chaos before it. Daniel Brooks stared at the terminal, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. But his attention was no longer on the system, it was on her. The woman who had just stepped back beside her cart as if she had simply adjusted a chair or wiped a desk. "How did you?" he began. But the question collapsed before it fully formed, because he did not even know where to start. One of the engineers leaned closer to the screen, scrolling through the changes, his voice barely above a whisper. "She did not just fix it, she restructured the entire call logic." Another shook his head slowly. "That is not something you improvise." The words spread through the room, not loud, but undeniable. Evelyn did not react to any of it. She simply picked up her mop again, adjusting the handle with the same calm precision she had used on the keyboard, as if both tasks belonged equally in her hands. Daniel took a step toward her, his tone different now, stripped of the sharp edge it carried before. "Evelyn, right?" he said, reading her name from the small badge clipped to her uniform. The first time he had truly looked at it. She nodded once, polite, neutral. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. Daniel hesitated, something unfamiliar settling into his posture. Not quite humility, not yet, but something close. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. And this time, the room listened. Every engineer, every analyst, their attention no longer on their screens but on her. Evelyn paused, just briefly, her gaze lowering for a second before returning to meet his. Not challenging, not defensive, just calm. "A long time ago," she said, simple, almost dismissive. But there was weight behind it, something unspoken, the kind of answer that suggested a story no one in that room had ever imagined. Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing back at the system, then at her again. The disconnect between what he saw and what he had believed still settling in. "You just saved us millions," he said, more to himself than to her. But Evelyn shook her head slightly, a faint almost smile touching her expression. "No," she replied softly. "The system just needed someone to listen to it properly." The words lingered, quiet but precise, cutting deeper than any confrontation could have. A few of the engineers looked down, others exchanged glances, the earlier laughter now distant, almost embarrassing in hindsight. Daniel stood there, the weight of the moment pressing in, the realization that expertise does not always wear a title, that intelligence does not always sit behind a desk, and that the person he had dismissed without a second thought had just done what none of them could. Evelyn adjusted her cart and turned slightly, ready to continue her route, the same path she had been walking before any of this began. No announcement, no expectation, just movement. And as she took her first step away, the room remained silent, not out of confusion anymore, but out of something new, something earned, because respect, once awakened, does not need to be demanded. It simply fills the space where arrogance used to stand. The sound of her cart's wheels rolling across the polished floor seemed louder now, not because it had changed, but because everything else had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a moment no one can quite explain. Daniel remained standing where he was, eyes still fixed on the terminal, but his focus had shifted entirely, not on the system that had just been saved, but on the woman walking away from it. "Wait," he said suddenly, the word cutting gently through the silence, not sharp like before, but uncertain, almost careful. Evelyn paused, turning slightly, her expression unchanged, calm, patient, as if interruptions did not disturb her rhythm. Daniel took another step forward, aware now of every pair of eyes in the room watching him. The same people who had followed his lead earlier, who had laughed when he dismissed her, and who were now waiting to see what he would do next. "You cannot just walk away," he said, though the confidence behind his words had softened, replaced by something closer to honesty. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, not confused, but curious. "Why not?" she asked simply, and the question landed heavier than expected. Daniel opened his mouth, then paused, realizing he did not have the kind of answer he was used to giving, not one built on authority or position, but something real, something earned. "Because what you just did, that is not normal," he admitted. The words slower now, measured. "We have people here with years of experience, degrees, certifications, and none of them saw what you saw." A few engineers shifted uncomfortably, not offended, but exposed. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the handle of her cart. "Experience can be loud," she said after a moment, her voice even, "but understanding is usually quiet." The sentence settled into the room, not as a challenge, but as a truth that did not need to raise its voice. Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding once, as if acknowledging something he had resisted before. "Then help me understand," he said, and this time there was no sarcasm, no edge, just a request, simple and direct. Evelyn studied him for a brief second, not judging, not impressed, just observing, as if deciding whether the question came from ego or from something deeper, behind them. One of the engineers pulled up the system logs again, reviewing her changes with growing amazement. "She optimized the entire structure," he whispered. "This is not just a fix, it is a redesign." Another added quietly, "No one does that on the fly." The realization continued to spread, not as noise, but as awareness. Daniel glanced back at the screen, then returned his attention to Evelyn. "You said the system just needed someone to listen," he continued. "What did you mean?" Evelyn's gaze shifted briefly toward the monitors, where clean data now flowed steadily, then back to him. "Systems tell you what is wrong," she said, "but only if you are not too busy trying to prove that you are right." The words were calm, but they carried weight, the kind that settles long after they are spoken. Daniel stood still, absorbing it, the tension that once drove him now replaced with something quieter, something more deliberate, and in that moment, the roles in the room had shifted completely, not through force, not through argument, but through clarity. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the cart once more, her movements unchanged, grounded, steady, as if none of this had altered who she was. And as she turned again to continue down the corridor, no one laughed this time, no one whispered, because the room had already learned what it needed to, and it was not about code or systems, or even the crisis that had just passed. It was about the cost of underestimating someone who never needed to be seen to understand everything. The corridor outside the control room felt different as Evelyn continued walking, not because the building had changed, but because the weight of what had just happened still lingered behind her. Inside that glass-walled space where certainty had quietly collapsed, she did not look back, not out of indifference, but because she never needed acknowledgement to validate what she already understood. Her steps remained even, steady, the soft rhythm of her cart wheels echoing faintly against the marble floor. Behind her, the room slowly began to breathe again, engineers returning to their stations, but not with the same energy as before. Something had shifted, something they could not ignore. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, staring at the doorway she had just passed through, as if trying to reconcile the version of reality he had believed in only an hour ago with the one now unfolding in front of him. "Run a full diagnostic," he finally said, his voice quieter, more controlled, but no longer driven by urgency. One of the engineers nodded quickly, already typing, but his eyes flicked once toward the hallway. Everything she did is holding, he reported after a few seconds. Not just holding, it is cleaner than before. Another engineer leaned back slightly, shaking his head in disbelief. We were patching symptoms, she removed the cause. The words settled heavily, not as criticism, but as clarity. Daniel moved toward the terminal again, reviewing the structure she had left behind, his expression focused, but no longer defensive. Each line of logic revealed something he had missed, not because he lacked knowledge, but because he had been looking in the wrong way. Too fast, too certain, too loud in his own thinking. Find out everything you can about her, he said without turning. And this time, no one questioned the request. It was not curiosity driven by ego, but by recognition, something rare, something earned. One of the junior analysts hesitated slightly before responding. She has been here for almost a year, he said, pulling up internal records. Night shift mostly. Maintenance contract. Nothing unusual. Daniel frowned slightly. Nothing unusual, he repeated, almost to himself, the phrase sounding hollow now, as if the definition itself had just been rewritten. Down the hall, Evelyn reached the end of the corridor and paused briefly beside a window overlooking the city. The skyline stretched wide under the afternoon light, glass towers reflecting the sun in sharp, clean lines. She stood there for a second, her expression calm, unreadable, as if measuring something beyond the view itself. Then she adjusted her grip on the cart and turned the corner, disappearing from sight just as quietly as she had entered. Back inside the control room, Daniel straightened slowly, his posture no longer rigid, but grounded, deliberate, the kind of stance that comes after a realization you cannot unlearn. Next time, he said, his voice steady now. We listen before we assume. No one laughed, no one argued, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through authority, not through instruction, but through action so precise it left no room for doubt. And somewhere beyond the walls of that room, the woman they had once overlooked continued her work, unchanged, unannounced, carrying with her the kind of understanding that does not need recognition to exist, because the most powerful truths rarely introduce themselves. They simply reveal who was paying attention all along. The building had settled back into its rhythm, but something subtle had changed beneath the surface, not in the systems, not in the metrics, but in the way people moved, the way they spoke, the way they looked at the spaces between what they thought they understood. Daniel stood alone for a moment near the window after the room had cleared, the city stretching out before him in clean lines and quiet confidence. But his mind was not on the skyline. It was replaying the past hour, every assumption, every dismissal, every moment he had overlooked something simply because it did not fit his expectations. Behind him, one of the senior engineers approached carefully, not with urgency, but with curiosity. We checked her access logs, he said, holding a tablet. She never logged into the system before today. Daniel turned slightly, brows narrowing. That is not possible, he replied instinctively, but the certainty in his voice no longer carried the same weight. The engineer nodded slowly. I thought the same, but there is no record. Nothing, not even a failed attempt. Daniel looked back at the tablet, scanning the data, searching for something that would restore the logic he was used to relying on, but there was nothing. No explanation that fit cleanly into the framework he trusted. Then how did she? He began, but the sentence faded, unfinished, because the answer was already there, just not in a form he was comfortable accepting. Down in the lower levels of the building, Evelyn moved through another hallway, quieter, less polished, the kind of space most employees never saw, where the hum of machinery replaced the chatter of meetings. She stopped briefly beside a maintenance panel, adjusting something small. Almost instinctive, her movements efficient, practiced, as if every environment spoke a language she understood. A coworker passed by, nodding politely. Unaware of anything beyond the routine, Evelyn returned the nod with the same quiet presence she carried everywhere. Nothing about her demanded attention, and yet everything about her reflected control. Back upstairs, Daniel handed the tablet back, exhaling slowly. Find her, he said, not sharply, but with intention. I want to speak with her again. The engineer hesitated for a moment, then nodded. turning to leave. But as he reached the door, he paused, glancing back. "What are you going to say?" he asked, the question simple, but loaded. Daniel remained still, his gaze drifting once more toward the hallway where she had disappeared, and for the first time in a long time, he did not have a prepared answer. No script, no authority to rely on. Just a realization forming quietly beneath the surface. "I do not know yet," he admitted, his voice steady, but thoughtful. "But whatever it is, it will not start with me talking." The room fell into a gentle silence again. Not heavy, not tense, just reflective, because somewhere between the failure and the fix, between the noise and the stillness, something had shifted that could not be undone, and far from the attention, far from the recognition beginning to build, Evelyn continued her work, unseen, uninterrupted, carrying with her the kind of knowledge that does not seek validation, because it does not need to be proven. It only needs the right moment to be revealed, and when it is, it does not raise its voice. It simply changes everything around it. By the time the search reached the lower levels of the building, the urgency had faded, replaced by something quieter, more deliberate, the kind of intention that does not rush because it finally understands what it is looking for. The engineer who had been sent downstairs slowed his pace as the environment changed around him, the polished floors and glass walls replaced by concrete corridors and the steady hum of infrastructure. This was not a place he visited often, not a place that demanded attention, and yet now it felt like the most important part of the entire building. He spotted her near the end of the hallway, Evelyn Carter, exactly where no one important ever looked, adjusting a small panel with calm precision, as if the world above had never been in crisis. "Evelyn," he called out, his voice careful, almost respectful. She turned slightly, her expression neutral but attentive. "Yes," she replied, simple as always. He hesitated for a brief second, as if realizing that whatever he said next needed to be different from how people usually spoke to her. "Daniel wants to see you," he said, and for the first time, those words carried no authority, only invitation. Evelyn studied him for a moment, not surprised, not curious, just aware, then nodded once. "All right," she said quietly, wiping her hands lightly before placing them back on the handle of her cart. The two of them walked back toward the elevators, the silence between them not uncomfortable, just unfilled, as if neither felt the need to rush into conversation. When the doors opened and they stepped inside, the reflection in the metal walls showed two very different roles standing side by side. But something about that contrast no longer felt as defined as it had before. Upstairs, Daniel stood near the center of the control room again. But this time the room was nearly empty, the chaos replaced by order, the noise replaced by stillness. He had asked everyone to leave, not because he needed space, but because he understood that what needed to be said did not belong in front of an audience. When the elevator doors opened and Evelyn stepped out, pushing her cart with the same steady rhythm, he turned to face her, not with the posture of someone in charge, but with the presence of someone learning. "Thank you for coming," he said, and even that felt different, the words not automatic, but chosen. Evelyn nodded once, her gaze steady. "You asked," she replied simply. Daniel took a slow breath, as if organizing thoughts that were no longer built on certainty. "I owe you more than a thank you," he said, his voice calm, measured. "What you did today, we could not have recovered from that on our own." Evelyn listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, just present. Daniel continued. "And I realize now that I did not even see you before today." The admission hung in the air, quiet but significant, the kind that does not need to be emphasized to be understood. Evelyn's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, not approval, not judgment, just acknowledgement. "Most people do not," she said softly, "not bitter, not proud, just honest." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing it. "That is going to change," he replied, not as a promise to her, but as a decision for himself. The room remained still, the hum of machines steady, the crisis now nothing more than a memory, but the lesson, the shift in perspective, that remained, because sometimes the most important moment is not when the problem is solved, but when the person who thought they understood everything realizes they were not even asking the right questions to begin with. Daniel did not speak immediately after that moment, because for the first time in a long time, He understood that silence could carry more weight than explanation. The control room stood still around them, screen steady, system stable. But the real shift was not on any monitor. It was in the space between them, where assumptions had quietly dissolved. Evelyn rested her hands lightly on the handle of her cart, her posture unchanged, grounded in a way that did not depend on recognition or validation. Daniel studied her for a moment, not as a manager evaluating an employee, but as someone trying to understand a perspective he had never considered before. You said earlier that people try too hard to prove they are right. He began, his voice thoughtful, measured. Is that what happened here? Evelyn glanced briefly toward the screens, then back at him, her expression calm. You were not wrong, she said. You were just not listening to what the system was actually saying. The distinction settled into the room, subtle but precise. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the difference, because it was not about competence, it was about approach, about the quiet space where observation replaces assumption. And you saw it immediately, he said, not as a challenge, but as a realization. Evelyn did not hesitate. It was not hidden, she replied. It was just overlooked. The words carried no judgment, only clarity, and that made them harder to ignore. Daniel let out a slow breath, glancing down for a moment before looking back up. I built this team to be the best, he said, but today showed me something we are missing. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, listening. What is that? She asked. Daniel's expression shifted, not defensive, not proud, just honest. Perspective, he said. The word simple, but weighted. We have knowledge, we have experience, but we do not always have the patience to step back and see what is actually in front of us. Evelyn considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod. Speed can feel like progress, she said, but it often hides what is important. The conversation unfolded without tension, without hierarchy, just two people standing in a space that had finally quieted enough to allow understanding to surface. Daniel glanced toward the doorway, then back at her. I want you to be part of this team, he said, the offer direct, but not forceful, as if he already understood that the decision would not be his to make. Evelyn's expression remained unchanged, but there was a pause, not hesitation, but thought. I already am part of this building, she replied softly, just not in the way you are used to noticing. Daniel almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but recognition, because it was true, more true than anything he had said all day. He stepped back slightly, giving her space, not as a formality, but as respect, something he had not offered before. Then maybe it is time we start noticing differently, he said. And this time, the words were not a statement of authority, but a shift in awareness. Evelyn nodded once, a small, quiet acknowledgement, then adjusted her cart again, preparing to leave, her role unchanged on the surface, but now understood in a way it had not been before. As she turned toward the hallway, the room did not feel the same as it had when she first entered, because now, every quiet detail, every overlooked corner, carried a different meaning, and Daniel remained standing there, not as the man who controlled the room, but as someone who had finally realized that control is not always about having the answers. Sometimes it is about knowing when to listen to the person no one else thought to. Here the hallway seemed longer this time, as Evelyn moved away from the control room, not because the distance had changed, but because something behind her had. The weight of attention followed quietly, not in footsteps, but in awareness. Upstairs, Daniel remained still for a few seconds after she left, his eyes lingering on the doorway before turning back to the screens, not out of urgency, but reflection. He approached the terminal again, scrolling through the system architecture she had reshaped. Each line now made more sense than before, not because it was more complex, but because it was clearer, and that realization settled deeper than any technical explanation could. One of the senior engineers stepped back into the room, hesitant at first, as if unsure whether the conversation that had just taken place had changed more than just the system. Everything is holding steady, he reported, his tone respectful, but quieter than earlier. Daniel nodded once, still studying the structure. Of course it is, he replied, not with arrogance, but with certainty earned through what he had just witnessed. The engineer paused, then added, we have been reviewing her changes. There is a pattern here. Daniel glanced up slightly. What kind of pattern? He asked. The engineer stepped closer, pointing to a section of code. She simplified everything, he explained. We kept adding layers, trying to protect the system from failure, but she removed the layers entirely and fixed the root. It is cleaner. The word lingered, unintentionally symbolic. Daniel leaned back slightly, absorbing it, because the truth was becoming clearer with every second. They had not been solving the problem, they had been complicating it. And she had seen through that immediately, not because she knew more, but because she approached it differently. We need to rethink how we build systems, Daniel said quietly, not as an order, but as a realization. The engineer nodded, already understanding that this was not about rewriting code, but about rewriting perspective. Down the hall, Evelyn continued her routine, stopping at another section of the building, wiping a surface that reflected the overhead lights in smooth, uninterrupted lines. Her movements steady, unhurried, as if nothing in the past hour had altered her rhythm. A junior staff member passed by, offering a polite smile, unaware of the shift that had taken place just floors above. Evelyn returned the gesture with the same quiet acknowledgement she offered to everyone. No more, no less. Back upstairs, Daniel stepped away from the terminal, his posture no longer rigid, but grounded, as if something inside him had realigned. He looked around the room, seeing it differently now, not just as a space of expertise, but as a space that had missed something essential. Call a meeting for tomorrow morning, he said, his voice steady. Full team. The engineer nodded, already moving to make it happen, but paused for a moment. What is the agenda? He asked. Daniel took a brief breath, his gaze drifting once more toward the doorway. We are going to start by asking better questions, he said. The words simple, but deliberate. The engineer nodded again, understanding that whatever came next would not be the same as before, because sometimes the most important change is not visible on a screen, not measurable in numbers, but felt in the way people begin to see what was always there. And as Evelyn moved quietly through the building, unnoticed once again by most, the truth followed her, not as recognition, but as impact, because the strongest influence does not need to stay in the room to be felt. It only needs to change the way the room thinks long after it is gone. The next morning arrived with a different kind of anticipation, not loud, not urgent, but steady, like a shift that had already begun before anyone walked into the room. The control center filled again, but this time the energy was quieter, more focused. Engineers took their seats without the usual chatter, screens lit up, but no one rushed to prove anything. They waited, and when Daniel Brooks stepped forward, there was no performance in his posture, no trace of the sharp authority that once defined him. Only clarity. He looked around the room, making brief eye contact with each person, not to command attention, but to acknowledge it. Yesterday, he began, his voice even. We faced a failure that none of us could solve in time. He paused, letting the truth settle without resistance. And the solution did not come from where we expected. No one spoke, but the room understood exactly what he meant. A few exchanged glances, others looked down briefly, not out of shame, but reflection. Daniel continued. We have built this team on skill, knowledge, and experience. And those things matter, he said, but they are not enough if we stop listening. The words landed differently now, not as criticism, but as direction. One of the senior engineers leaned forward slightly, attentive. Daniel turned toward the main screen, pulling up the system architecture from the previous day, the version Evelyn had reshaped. This is what clarity looks like, he said, pointing to the simplified structure. No excess, no noise, just understanding. The room studied it, not as code, but as a lesson. We did not fail because we lacked intelligence, Daniel added. We failed because we assumed we already knew where to look. Silence followed, not empty, but full, because everyone in that room recognized themselves in that statement. After a moment, a voice from the back spoke up, cautious but sincere. So what changes? The question hung in the air, and Daniel turned slightly, considering it. We change how we approach problems, he said. We slow down when it matters. We question what we think we know, and we pay attention to perspectives we would normally overlook. Another engineer nodded slowly, absorbing it. Even if it comes from someone outside the team, he added quietly. Daniel gave a small nod in return. Especially then, he replied. The emphasis subtle, but clear. The room shifted again, not in discomfort, but in awareness, because the definition of value had expanded beyond titles and roles. At the back of the room, a junior analyst glanced toward the doorway, almost instinctively, as if expecting someone to be there, but it remained empty. The presence that had changed everything was not part of this meeting, and yet it was felt in every word, every pause, every adjustment in tone. Daniel noticed the glance, and for a brief moment, his expression softened, not with regret, but with understanding. "Some of the most important contributions we will ever see," he said, "will not come from the loudest voice in the room." The sentence settled, firm and quiet, the kind that reshapes how people think long after it is spoken. Outside, in another part of the building, Evelyn moved through her routine once again, her path unchanged, her pace steady, as if the previous day had simply passed like any other. She paused briefly by a window, the morning light reflecting softly across the floor, then continued on, unseen by most, but no longer unknown in the way she had been before, because while she did not stand in that room, her impact did, and as the meeting came to a close, no one rushed out, no one returned immediately to their tasks. They lingered for just a second longer, as if holding on to something they had not fully understood before, because sometimes the most powerful shift is not in what you learn, but in what you finally begin to notice. The rest of the day unfolded with a quiet precision that had not been there before, not because the work had changed, but because the people doing it had. Conversations became shorter, more intentional, less about proving and more about understanding, and Daniel noticed it in the smallest ways, in the pauses before someone spoke, in the way engineers double-checked assumptions instead of defending them. In the absence of that subtle urgency to be right at all costs, he stood near the back of the room for most of the afternoon, not directing, not interrupting, just observing, something he had not allowed himself to do in years. And what he saw was not weakness, not hesitation, but clarity beginning to take shape. One of the senior engineers approached him later, holding a tablet. "We ran a full rebuild using her structure as a baseline," he said, his tone measured but impressed. "Performance improved by 30% across the board, fewer redundancies, fewer failure points." Daniel nodded slowly, not surprised, but still absorbing the depth of what that meant. "She did not just fix a problem," the engineer added. "She changed how the system thinks." The phrase lingered, because it was not just about code anymore. Daniel glanced across the room, watching his team work in a way that felt more grounded, more aware, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to step in, because the direction had already shifted. Later that evening, as the building began to quiet again, Daniel made his way down to the lower levels, not with urgency, not with authority, but with intention. The hum of machinery greeted him as he stepped into the less visible parts of the building, the spaces that supported everything above but rarely received acknowledgement. He walked slowly, taking in details he had never noticed before: the layout, the structure, the quiet efficiency of systems that simply worked without needing recognition. And then he saw her again, Evelyn Carter, at the far end of the hallway, wiping down a surface with the same steady rhythm she always carried. She did not look up immediately, as if she already knew someone was there, and when she did, her expression remained calm, unchanged. "You are still working," Daniel said, the observation simple, but genuine. Evelyn gave a small nod. "The building does not stop," she replied, her voice soft but clear. Daniel took a few steps closer, stopping at a respectful distance, no longer closing space out of habit, but maintaining it out of understanding. "Neither did you," he said, and there was something different in the way he spoke now. Not praise, not admiration, but recognition. Evelyn paused for a brief moment, then continued her motion, as if the statement did not require a response, because for her, it did not. Daniel studied her quietly, then spoke again. "I have been thinking about what you said," he continued, "about listening instead of assuming." Evelyn glanced at him briefly, then back to her work. "It is not something people learn quickly," she said. "It requires them to notice what they usually ignore." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience. Daniel nodded slowly, because he understood now that this was not a lesson that could be delivered in a meeting or written into a process. It had to be realized, earned through moments like the one he had experienced. "I almost missed it completely," he admitted, his voice quieter now. And this time, Evelyn stopped, just for a second, looking at him directly, not with judgment, not with approval, but with clarity. Most people do, she said, and in that moment, there was no tension, no hierarchy, just truth, steady and undeniable, because sometimes the most important thing a person can realize is not that they were wrong, but that they were not even looking in the right direction to begin with. The hum of the lower level carried on, steady and uninterrupted, as if the building itself had no interest in who noticed it or who did not. Evelyn resumed her work with the same quiet rhythm, but something in the space between them had shifted, not in tension, but in understanding. Daniel remained where he stood for a moment longer, no longer searching for answers in the way he once did, but allowing them to settle in naturally. "Why do you stay here?" he asked after a pause, the question not intrusive, but genuine. Evelyn did not look up immediately, her hands moving in calm, deliberate motions. "Because this is where I am needed," she replied, simple, direct, and without hesitation. Daniel considered that, glancing around the corridor, the pipes, the panels, the infrastructure that supported everything above without recognition. "You could be somewhere else," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a statement of fact. Evelyn stopped briefly, turning her gaze toward him. "I have been," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying a depth that had not been spoken aloud until now. Daniel did not interrupt, sensing that what followed was not something offered lightly. "Places where people talk more than they listen," she continued, "where complexity is valued more than clarity, and where being seen matters more than understanding." The words were not bitter, but reflective, shaped by experience rather than resentment. Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in them, because he had been part of that world, had built his success within it. "And you left," he said, more as a realization than a question. Evelyn gave a small nod, returning to her work. "It was not the right place for how I think," she said. "So I chose somewhere quieter." The simplicity of the explanation carried more weight than any detailed story could. Daniel looked around again, this time not seeing a lower level or a background space, but a different kind of environment, one that did not compete for attention, one that allowed clarity to exist without interruption. "And yet you still see everything," he said, the observation almost to himself. Evelyn paused again, just for a second, then continued, "When things are quiet, it is easier to notice what matters," she replied, the statement calm, but precise. Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something finally aligns in a way it had not before. "I built my career on being heard," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I am starting to understand that I was not always listening." Evelyn did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because the statement did not require confirmation. It was already understood. After a moment, she finished the section she was working on and adjusted her cart slightly, preparing to move on. Daniel stepped aside instinctively, not as a gesture, but as a reflection of the shift that had taken place within him. "Thank you," he said again. But this time the words were different, not for what she had done, but for what she had revealed. Evelyn gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, then moved past him, continuing down the corridor with the same steady pace. No announcement, no expectation, just movement. And as Daniel stood there watching her disappear into the quiet of the building, he understood something that could not be undone, that the most valuable perspective is often the one that does not compete to be seen, and that the greatest clarity does not come from speaking louder, but from finally learning how to listen in the spaces where no one else thinks to look. The building returned to its quiet rhythm as the evening settled in, lights dimming slightly across the upper floors while the lower levels remained steady and unchanged, the kind of consistency that does not depend on recognition. Daniel stood alone near the window once more, the city now glowing under soft evening light. But his attention was no longer drawn to the skyline. It had shifted inward, towards something less visible but far more important. The events of the past day replayed in fragments, not as chaos, but as clarity, each moment revealing something he had overlooked, not because it was hidden, but because he had not been looking for it. Behind him, the control room operated smoothly, quieter than before, more deliberate, engineers working with a different kind of awareness, conversations measured, decisions thoughtful. And Daniel realized that the system had not been the only thing that had been rebuilt. Something deeper had changed, something that would continue long. After the memory of the crisis faded, he stepped away from the window and walked slowly through the room, noticing details that had always been there but had never held his attention. The way one engineer paused before speaking, the way another double-checked a simple assumption, the absence of rushed certainty. It was subtle but undeniable, and as he reached the doorway, he paused for a moment, looking back, not with ownership, but with understanding. Then he turned and made his way down the corridor, the same path he had taken before, but now each step carried a different awareness. When he reached the lower levels, the hum of machinery greeted him again, steady and unchanged, and for the first time, he understood that this part of the building had always been just as important as everything above it. He walked past the panels, the pipes, the quiet systems that supported everything without ever being seen. And then he saw her, Evelyn Carter, at the far end of the hallway, moving. With the same calm presence, her routine uninterrupted, her pace steady, as if nothing needed to be said. Daniel did not call out this time. He did not interrupt. He simply stood for a moment, watching, not out of curiosity, but respect, because he understood now that not everything meaningful requires interaction. Some things are meant to be recognized quietly, without needing to be changed. Evelyn continued her work, unaware or perhaps simply unconcerned with being observed, her focus on the task in front of her, grounded, precise, complete. And after a moment, Daniel gave a small nod, not to her, but to the realization itself, then turned and walked back the way he came, not because the moment was over, but because it had already done what it needed to do. The lesson did not require repetition. It only required recognition. And as he stepped back into the upper levels, into the space he once believed he fully understood, he carried with him something different, something quieter, something more lasting. Because the true measure of intelligence is not how quickly you solve a problem, but how deeply you are willing to question what you think you already know. And somewhere below, beyond the reach of titles and expectations, the woman they once overlooked continued her work, unchanged, unseen, and entirely understood. And that day, without announcement or applause, the building remembered what quiet dignity looks like.